Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about endangered and extinct organisms. So we'll talk about what those words actually mean, and then I'm going to analyse this topic, which is aimed at Key Stage 4, by looking at 4 particular areas: why species are becoming endangered or extinct, what ways we can help protect them, why we have conservation programmes, and then we're going to look at ways that you can evaluate how successful a conservation programme has been. So I think the first thing to do is understand what these two words mean. Endangered means that there is a risk of a particular organism becoming extinct, where the numbers have completely declined. So endangered organisms are those where there is a very low population number of them. Extinct means that that organism is no longer in existence. Now, sadly, this tiger that I've put in the middle of the screen here, there's only about, I think it's 3,200 or so wild tigers in existence. So this very precious animal, there's only a very, very small number across the globe. So they are a massively endangered species. So I think it's right that we start with the why. Reasons why particular organisms may face extinction. So the first one I'm going to note is competition. Now this could be competition within the species or competition between different species, so intra and inter-specific competition. Gow's is principle, which I've done a video on. Gow's was a scientist who said that if two organisms are similar, if they compete for resources, one would be out-competed and no longer survive perhaps, or may have to just accept lesser conditions, if you like. So competition could be a significant reason as to why a population has declined. The one that most students think of when I ask them this is hunting. Clearly, many different organisms are hunted for many, many different reasons. So hunting is a significant reason as to why numbers, particularly tigers, are so low. Habitat destruction is a massive thing to consider. Organisms adapt to an environment in which they live. They have their own habitat, and in many cases a microhabitat, a smaller sort of living unit of that habitat. And if those habitats are being destroyed, these organisms have nowhere to live, nowhere to thrive, if you like. I mean, the best example that I think of is deforestation. Mass deforestation around the globe, not just significantly lowering population of organisms, it's massively reducing species diversity and biodiversity overall. Linked with habitat destruction is pollution. Now, pollution as a subheading is quite a big one. We're talking about maybe thinking sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, different kind of pollutants that have devastating consequences in different kind of habitats. So in water, for example, so we think about the formation of acid rain, if acid rain was to get into soils or waterways. And even, I know that students study lichens. So lichen species are massively affected by the amount of sulfur dioxide. So one of the reasons why certain organisms may be at risk is as a result of pollution. And in that, I'm also going to finish this mini section by writing climate change. Organisms, to survive, need to adapt to an ever-changing environment. And if they can't, then they most likely will not survive. And we know that the time that this period that we're living in at the moment is a period where climate change is a real concern. So I think leading on to that, we need to look at ways that we can help endangered species. So I'm just going to lift this up a tiny little bit because I think that nicely leads on to ways of protection. I think we need to think about how can we protect endangered species. One of the key things for me is protection of the habitats. Destruction of habitats leads to reduced population of organisms that live in them. It's really that simple. Now, as part of that, I'm going to put in red here as well, in legal protection might be required. So changes in laws governing which areas of land can be used for certain things. For example, I know there are things called SSIs, Sites of Special Scientific Interest, which I know have legal protection, deliberately for this very reason. So as well as looking at protecting the actual habitats, a massive thing we should consider are education programs. Now I know when I teach this topic itself, many students, would guess that hunting and competition perhaps lead to endangered and extinct organisms, but maybe not the full range of ones I've gone into here, and certainly might not know the reasons why conservation programs are so critical. So educating people about the plight of these endangered species is definitely a way forward. Captive breeding programs can also be used, as well as creating artificial ecosystems. Now, an ecosystem that is managed or altered by human activity is referred to as an artificial ecosystem. An example can include woodlands, lakes, forestry plantations, and fish farms. Now, within this ecosystem, usually one species is deliberately protected and any other species is removed that would directly affect the yield. So that's the last one that I'm going to mention in this list, which is really important, a means of protecting these endangered creatures. So, really important, we have artificial ecosystems. So we've said why certain organisms are becoming endangered and extinct, and we've said how it's possible to offer some element of protection. Now we need to think about reasons for having conservation programs. Why would we try and conserve such organisms? So I'm going to do this side in red over here. So we're going to look at the why of conservation programs. Now, one of the big reasons why we would do this is for cultural reasons. So let's just explain what I mean by cultural reasons. Individual species may be important in maybe a nation or a particular area's cultural heritage. So to conserve that would be, if you like, to be protecting that particular area's history in a way. But if we move away from cultural reasons and think more about actual food and food webs, protecting a food supply is one of the really big reasons why conservation programs are required. If we think of fishing as an example, overfishing has greatly reduced fish stocks in the world's oceans. So conservation programs can ensure that future generations will have fish to eat. So we're maintaining food supplies for future generations by conserving particular organisms. Now, with that, we need to consider food chains. If you take an organism out of, say, a complex food web, the effect on that is so dramatic. If we think of one basic food chain with a producer, a primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer, if you knock out the secondary consumer, you have effects on the primary consumer because now there's less of its predator, if you like, to eat them. There's less food, however, for the tertiary consumer. So just in that simple food chain, you can see the effects. Now, in a very large food web, I can imagine that the effect would be much more magnified. If one species became extinct, it would affect all the organisms that feed on and are eaten by that species. So this means conserving one species can actually help others to survive. So minimal damage to food chains is one of the reasons why we have these conservation programs. And I'm just going to put here medical purposes, because that's too important. Many of the medicines that we use today actually derive from plants. So if we're just allowing certain plant species to just become extinct, those plants may contain new medicinal chemicals. So we could be missing out on valuable medicines and resources if we're not conserving them. So there's a few reasons why conservation programs are important. For the cultural aspects, to protect our food supplies and to ensure minimal damage to food chains, but also for medical purposes. And I'm just going to put a little asterisk by that, because that's one not to forget, because when I teach this lesson, students often think about endangered animals, like the tiger that I have in the centre, but they often forget about plant species. So that's a key thing there to make a note of. So it talks about why particular organisms or species are becoming endangered and extinct. We've talked about how we can offer them protection. We've said why conservation programs are important. But let's think about evaluating how successful a conservation program is, or has been rather, because there are 4 things that I would want to look at in evaluating how successful such a program has been. And that's where I'm going to finish this particular video. I'm just going to consider 4 things that will allow us to assess whether this conservation program has actually been working. Now, the 4 things that I think are most important to consider are genetic variation, or the amount of genetic variation, if you like. Now, if genetic variation is low, then a species is less likely to adapt to changes in the environment, or even survive if a new disease happens to emerge. Now, genetic variation, as a definition, if you like, looks at the different alleles, which are alternate versions of genes, in a particular population. So the greater the genetic variation, the more chance you have of organisms being able to adapt to changes, but also survive if something devastating like a disease were to appear. Because if they didn't have that genetic variation, if one particular organism was susceptible, then most likely all would be. So genetic variation, or the amount of genetic variation, is one thing you definitely need to consider. Secondly, I'm going to write here, reproductive viability. Let's think about what I mean by that. There needs to be enough males and females to actually mate. Otherwise, we're never going to get a population increase for a given species. So there have to be sufficient males and females in their reproductive cycles to be able to raise that population, but also enough to prevent inbreeding. Now, inbreeding, so breeding within a small number of a population, if you like, so breeding related individuals together, for example, will massively reduce genetic variation. And we've just said that you need genetic variation. So you need to prevent inbreeding or breeding of particular relatives by having enough males and females of reproductive age. So the third one that I want to discuss, and it relates back to something I said in protection, would be having available habitats. There must be habitats to allow organisms to survive and thrive. You need those homes for them, if you like. But more than that, if you have a particular organism that's a specialist, so I've done a video on the difference between specialists and generalists. Specialists are those that can only adapt to one really type of environment, eat one very particular type of food, and thrive in only a very narrow range of environmental conditions. If you are a specialist, you are definitely going to need a very specific habitat available, or you're never going to increase that population number. And finally, I'm going to put here species interactions. Now, it is important that species interact with each other as they would in a natural environment. So, for example, predator species should be allowed to hunt prey. Because if you don't simulate what would essentially occur in a natural environment, you're going to have a less successful conservation program. This is going to rely on increasing population numbers in a natural or as natural manner as possible. So without those correct interactions between different species, without the available habitats for them to survive in, without that reproductive viability, and without sufficient genetic variation, so these 4 things I've listed in green, you're not going to have a successful conservation program. Okay, I hope all that helps.